So for thousands of years, the parting of the Red Sea has basically been sold to us as this ultimate magic trick.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, you know the cinematic version, the whole
Right.
Charlton Heston Sunday school setup. You've got a guy in a robe, he raises a wooden stick, and the fundamental laws of physics just, like, hit the pause button.
Right, the literal ocean unzips itself.
Yeah, into these two towering, impossible walls of water. And then an entire empire just gets drowned by a divine snap of the fingers. It is a massive spectacle.
And it is incredibly comforting to think about history that way, you know?
It really is. Because if it's just a magic show, we don't actually have to analyze the mechanics of it. We just sit back, eat our popcorn, and watch the fireworks.
Exactly.
But what if the greatest miracle in human history wasn't a miracle at all? Like, what if instead of a supernatural magic wand, what we are actually looking at is a masterclass in systems engineering?
That is just such a phenomenal question. And when you step away from that cinematic spectacle and, step into the world of actual textually grounded social physics, that whole Hollywood apparatus completely shatters.
It really does.
You realize you are looking at a historical landscape that is far more rigorous, far more logical, and honestly, far more terrifying than a fairy tale.
And that is exactly our mission for you today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are taking a sledgehammer to the spectacle.
Yes, we are.
We have a really fascinating source in front of us today. It's a detailed sociological and linguistic analysis of a foundational text on civilizational survival. Specifically, we're diving into Lecture 6 of the Tolu Islam series.
Right, which meticulously dissects Surah 26, known as Ash-Shu'ara, specifically verses 52 through 74.
Yeah, and we're going to strip away centuries of religious sentimentality here. We are looking at two of the most famous historical narratives in human history. So Moses at the Red Sea, and then right after that, Abraham confronting his community.
Well, we are analyzing them strictly as structural case studies.
Exactly. We're looking at the big mechanics of extractive empires, the physics of societal collapse, and the paralyzing inertia of inherited traditions.
The sheer audacity of this source material is really what makes it so compelling. I mean, the thesis it presents is intensely provocative.
Oh, for sure.
It argues that the Red Sea episode, verses 63 through 66, is the most visually spectacular moment in the entire Moses narrative, which is, precisely why it is the most consistently misread.
Right.
Every commentator, historically, reaches for the miraculous. But this analysis argues that the spectacle totally buries the structural argument of the text.
Because once you strip away that assumption of magic, what you actually witness is something called the law of requital.
Exactly. The concept of mukafare amal.
Right. The physics of cause and effect operating at this massive macro-sociological scale. So the premise is that you have a system, Pharaoh's empire, that is built entirely, like 100%, on extracting value from a subjugated, productive population.
Yeah, an extractive monopoly.
And this system pursues that productive population to the absolute edge of its own destruction. The gap between those two groups, the pursuer and the pursued, is not a miracle. It is just the inevitable mathematical consequence of what each system inherently is.
Precisely. And the source text does something structurally brilliant right after this macro-level collapse.
Right. It shifts gears entirely.
Yeah. Immediately following the destruction of Pharaoh's empire at the sea, in verses 69 through 74, the narrative abruptly jumps across time and space. We go straight to Abraham, who is having this highly tense confrontation with his father and his community about idol worship.
Which, on the surface, that feels like a totally random editing choice.
It really does.
You go from the geopolitics of a collapsing empire drowning in the ocean straight into an argument at a family dinner table.
But the source insists this jump is incredibly deliberate.
Right. The text is moving from a macro-level case study to a micro-level case study. It is showing you the exact same structural dynamic, the exact same psychological architecture, but operating inside a single family.
It's an argument about scale, ultimately. I mean, the disease that destroys vast civilizations is the exact same disease that paralyzes individuals and families. The scale changes, but the underlying physics remain absolutely identical.
Okay, let's build this from the ground up, starting at the macro level. I want to look at the psychological architecture of a dictatorship.
Let's do it.
So the source unpacks the lead up to the Red Sea event by taking us into what it calls a parliamentary debate within Pharaoh's cabinet. And it hinges on this concept of takabur.
Right, takabur.
Now, usually when we hear takabur, it just gets translated simply as arrogance or pride, which honestly sounds like a pretty standard personality flaw, like he's just an arrogant king.
Right.
But we see arrogant leaders all the time. They don't all drive their empires into the ocean. So why is the source insisting this is the fatal flaw here?
Because translating it merely as a mood or an ego problem is just a drastically insufficient way to understand the sociology of the text. In this framework, Takaber is not an emotion. It is a structural operating principle.
Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It specifically describes the state of a system or a leader believing themselves to be accountable to none. It is the assumption of being the final authority, possessing absolute sovereignty without any consequence.
Wow.
Yeah, it's the institutionalization of zero accountability.
So he doesn't just have a big ego. He structurally believes the rules of reality do not apply to him.
Exactly.
Let's use a modern equivalent to map this out for you listening. Imagine a massive, top-down, global corporate monopoly. This corporation has crushed all its competitors, it has bought out the regulators, and it essentially just dictates terms to the market.
A total monopoly.
Right. And the CEO of this monopoly doesn't just think he's the smartest guy in the room. He genuinely, structurally believes that the laws of economics, consumer blowback, financial audits, none of that applies to his company anymore. He believes he is the market.
That is a highly accurate mapping of the concept, because when a system operates on that level of Takaber, we have to ask, how does it view the people operating beneath it? How does it view the productive class?
Right, the workers.
It certainly doesn't view them as humans with inherent agency or rights or autonomy. It views them purely as resources. And we see this explicitly detailed in the sources analysis of how Pharaoh's cabinet talks about the fleeing Israelites.
What do they say?
Well, they don't refer to them as a rebellious nation or a political threat. They refer to them as a contemptible, small group that is merely provoking their anger.
Right. They aren't humans, they're malfunctioning machinery.
Exactly. To an extractive system, the subjugated population is just a resource base that has inexplicably stopped producing.
Like a broken conveyor belt.
Right. Think about a factory floor. When a machine stops working, the factory owner doesn't sit down and negotiate with the machine. He doesn't ask the machine about its working conditions.
No, he just gets angry at it.
Exactly. He either beats it back into compliance or he scraps it. Pharaoh's anger, as described in the text, isn't the anger of a betrayed political ally. It's the intense frustration of an owner whose conveyor belt has jammed. The text captures this perfectly when the cabinet says, these people are enraging us. The underlying sentiment is, how dare the resource demand autonomy?
Right. How dare the battery decide it doesn't want to power the machine anymore?
Exactly.
Which brings us to the actual turning point of the narrative, verse 26.52. Moses receives the directive to take his people and leave at night. Now, we've all seen the movie version of this, where it's a chaotic, panicked retreat.
Right. People running, screaming into the dark.
Yeah, clutching whatever they can carry because they're terrified of the army.
Yeah.
But the source material pushes back on that completely, doesn't it? It frames this entirely differently.
It really does. It frames this not as a panicked flight, but as a highly calculated strategic withdrawal. And this highlights an incredibly important sociological principle within the text.
Which is?
When you are dealing with a system built on Takaber, a system that relies entirely on your subjugation to survive and genuinely believes it is immune to accountability, that system is utterly unreformable from within.
Because you cannot negotiate with a parasite.
You absolutely cannot. You cannot sit down at the bargaining table with a system that requires your economic, physical, or psychological exhaustion to maintain its own life.
Right.
The parasite doesn't want to compromise. It wants your lifeblood. The text is making a profound point here. The only rational, logical action for the productive class in that scenario is to exit. You have to remove the resource base.
So the strategic withdrawal at night is essentially the ultimate act of defunding the extractive state.
It's a general strike of existence.
Yeah, they are running away. They are systematically unplugging themselves from the matrix.
Perfectly said.
But of course the matrix notices. The monopoly realizes its free labor force is walking out the door, and the entire economic engine of Egypt is about to collapse. So Pharaoh mobilizes the fully mechanized army.
Right, the chariots.
And this brings us to the water's edge, which sets up arguably the most misunderstood linguistic moment in the entire text. I really want to spend some time here, because this is where the source completely dismantles the magical interpretation. Let's look at the systemic versus the superstitious.
The setup at the water's edge is iconic. The Israelites reach the sea, forward momentum is blocked by impassable water. They look back and they see Pharaoh's fully armed, state-of-the-art chariot divisions bearing down on them.
Right.
The crowd naturally panics. In verse 61, they cry out, "We are caught," or we are overtaken. It is the absolute zenith of despair. The logic of tyranny seems inescapable.
And how does Moses respond? This is verse 26.62. He says, Kala inamai rabbi sayadini.
Right.
Now, if we look at the traditional spectacle-driven translations, this usually gets rendered as something like, no, my Lord is with me, he will guide me.
Yes.
And the implicit assumption we all make when we read that is, don't worry, guys, God is about to do a magic trick, just wait for it.
But the source material deconstructs these specific Arabic words and reveals a completely different intellectual engine running underneath.
Okay, so break down the word kala for us.
Kala is a fascinating linguistic tool in Arabic. It is a very strong refutation. But in this specific context, as the source points out, Moses is not merely trying to shout down the emotional fear of the crowd.
He's not just saying, cheer up.
No, he is making a structural counter-assertion. The people are looking at the chariots and the water, and they are concluding, the system of Pharaoh has caught us, the logic of brute force and tyranny has won.
Right.
Moses' kala is a definitive logical rejection of that premise. He is essentially saying, no, the premise of your despair is structurally flawed. You are misreading the physics of this situation.
I love that. And then he follows it up with ma'ia, which means with me.
Yes.
Again, we are so conditioned by the movie to read this as a claim of supernatural magical protection, like Moses has a divine force field around him. But the analysis here strips that magical thinking away entirely. What is he actually claiming is with him?
He is claiming that the rational, causal principles of the universe are with him. The claim that the Lord is with me is a statement about operating principles.
Oh, wow.
Moses is stating that the rational order he has been operating on from the very beginning, the laws of cause and effect, the pursuit of justice, the alignment with reality, that hasn't suddenly vanished just because the terrain got difficult.
Right.
The rational order of the universe does not abandon its operating principles mid-execution.
Help me bridge this gap for a listener who might still be clinging to the traditional view. How does aligning with a rational order stop a chariot? Because to the panicked crowd, a chariot is a very real, very physical threat, and a rational operating principle sounds like, abstract philosophy.
Let's use an analogy to clarify the epistemology of this moment. Think of it as the difference between blind faith and systemic certainty. Moses possesses an awareness of reality that the crowd lacks. The crowd only sees the immediate physical threat.
But Moses sees the structural limitations of the threat? Okay, let me try an analogy here. It's like a master aerospace engineer who is flying on a commercial plane that they personally designed and built from scratch.
Okay, I like this.
Suddenly, the plane hits massive, terrifying turbulence. The oxygen masks drop. The fuselage is shaking violently, the lights are flickering, and all the passengers are screaming.
Pure panic.
Right. They are looking at the shaking walls and concluding, we're going to crash. The sky is killing us. But the engineer is just sitting in their seat, sipping their coffee, completely calm.
Right, because they know the math.
Exactly. Why? Because the engineer knows the structural integrity of the airframe. They know the metallurgical limits of the wings. Their calmness isn't blind faith that the sky won't hurt them. It is systemic certainty in the design.
That is an excellent way to frame it. The passengers are the Israelites, reacting to the immediate sensory input of chaos. Moses is the engineer. He knows the structural limits of Pharaoh's extractive system. He knows that an empire built on blind arrogance cannot sustain itself indefinitely, especially when it is pulled out of the environment it controls. His certainty is rooted in the math of social physics.
But then we get to the very next verse, 26.63, and this is where I'm going to have to push back a little, or at least ask you to seriously defend the source's interpretation.
Go for it.
Because verse 63 contains the famous command, strike the sea with your staff. This is the moment the magic wand myth is born. We have hundreds of years of translation telling us he took a wooden stick, hit the H2O, and the laws of fluid dynamics paused for an hour.
Right.
The source argues against this.
Yeah.
How does it justify overturning centuries of accepted translation just to make it fit a sociological model?
It justifies it through a rigorous return to classical Arabic linguistics, specifically focusing on the polysemic nature of the word used in the text. The word is darab.
Yeah.
The linguistic evidence is actually overwhelming once you look past the medieval commentary.
So unpack darab for us. What does it actually mean?
Well, while darab can mean to hit or to strike in a literal physical sense, its broader, more idiomatic, and highly common usage in classical Arabic implies setting out on a journey or taking decisive action.
Wait, really?
Yes. For example, the phrase darab fi al-ard literally translates to striking out in the earth. But it doesn't mean hitting the dirt with a stick. It means to travel, to march, to seek a path, to go forth on a journey.
Okay, so the Arabic word is a bit of a linguistic chameleon. It changes entirely depending on its context.
Exactly. And the source argues that contextually, commanding a leader who is currently executing a strategic withdrawal to hit water with a stick makes zero logical sense.
Right.
The staff, historically, is the symbol of a shepherd's leadership and responsibility over his flock. So the text is not saying, take your magic wizard staff and cast a spell on the sea.
What is it saying then?
It's saying, take your community, take your people symbolized by the staff, and strike out, march, traverse toward the sea path. It's a command for movement and leadership, not a command for supernatural intervention.
Wow. So Moses isn't a wizard pausing reality. He is a general executing a highly risky tactical maneuver.
Precisely.
But that still leaves the actual parting of the water. Even if he marches them forward, how do they get across? The source brings up another specific Arabic word here, famfalaka, right?
Yes, and this is where the environmental context perfectly aligns with the linguistic analysis. The text uses the word fanfalaka, which means to break open, to cleave, or to separate.
Okay.
But crucially, it is the exact same root word used in classical Arabic to describe the dawn breaking.
The dawn breaking, which is a completely natural phenomenon.
Exactly. It describes a natural separation of light and dark. Furthermore, the source notes the historical and geographical reality of where this took place. They were at the Sea of Reeds, which is a tidal marshland area.
Oh, so not a massive, deep ocean.
They arrived at a specific time and place where the tide naturally receded, propelled by wind and lunar gravity, creating a temporary, naturally occurring gap. A dry path through the reeds and mud.
Okay, this is a massive paradigm shift. They navigated the natural environment intelligently. They didn't break the laws of nature. They utilized them.
Right.
They read the tides. They read the terrain. They recognized the window of opportunity, and they moved their people through the gap. But that still leaves the biggest piece of the cinematic myth, the drowning.
Yes.
If Moses didn't drop a literal ocean on Pharaoh's head, what actually killed him? From a systems engineering perspective, how did the empire die in the water?
This is where we fully enter part 3 of our analysis, the law of requital. The source argues that Pharaoh's army was destroyed by its own structural blindness.
How so?
Think deeply about what an extractive system actually is. It is a machine designed to operate in a highly controlled environment, a city, a factory, an agricultural basin where it dictates the rules, controls the resources, and faces no resistance.
Right. It relies on a paved road and a subjugated population.
Precisely. Now, what happens when Pharaoh's chariot divisions, driven by that takabur, that arrogant assumption that the whole world must automatically obey their authority? What happens when they plunge blindly into a tidal basin?
They assume the mud and the tide will bow to the CEOs, just like the boardroom does. They assume their political titles make them immune to physics.
And that is their fatal error. An extractive system, when deprived of its resource base, the fleeing Israelites, cannot sustain itself in an environment it has not designed for extraction.
Wow.
The desert and the sea do not care about Pharaoh's memos, his titles, or his divine right to rule. The physical environment wasn't actively, maliciously hostile to Pharaoh. It simply didn't run on pharaonic logic.
Right, on physical logic.
Right. The tide returns because the moon exerts gravity and not because God is angry at chariots.
This is so profound. The Israelites survived because they adapted to the reality of the natural world.
Yes.
They moved when the physical environment allowed it. Pharaoh's army died because they expected the natural world to adapt to their dictatorial authority. And when an arrogant organization built entirely on exploiting others and insulating itself from accountability hits the real world, where its internal power dynamics mean absolutely nothing, it structurally collapses.
Completely.
The heavy iron wheels of the chariots sink into the mud. The water fills their lungs. The system dies because it tried to enforce a social fiction onto physical reality.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the law of requital. Actions have inherent consequences based on their alignment with reality. And this brings the source to a radical redefinition of a very common, very misunderstood religious term, taqwa.
Yes. Let's get into this because this reframes everything we just talked about. Traditionally, if you ask someone what taqwa means, they will tell you it means fear of God or piety.
Right, an emotional state.
Yeah, it's treated entirely as an emotional state of religious devotion. You sit in a room, you feel guilty, you pray harder, and you have taqwa. But the source brings in a brilliant, intensely practical historical analogy from the early companions of the prophet to redefine it.
The analogy is striking because of how grounded it is. According to the historical account, a companion of the prophet was asked, "What does taqwa actually mean in practice?"
And he didn't give a theological answer.
No, he gave a topographical one. He asked the questioner, "Imagine you are walking down a very narrow path, and on both sides there are thick, sharp, thorny bushes. How do you walk down that path?"
And the obvious answer is, you gather your clothes tightly around you, you watch every single step, and you navigate carefully, adjusting your posture to avoid getting snagged, torn, and bleeding from the thorns.
Exactly. And the companion said, that is taqwa, that acute situational awareness, that hypervigilance to the reality of your environment. It is the active, conscious navigation of a complex and dangerous world.
I love this because it completely reframes the concept of divine guidance for you, the listener. True guidance in this structural framework isn't a magic carpet ride that just lifts you effortlessly over your problems.
No, not at all.
It's a topographical map. The rational system doesn't miraculously remove the thorns from the path. It doesn't permanently dry up the sea just so you don't have to get your feet wet.
Right.
It gives you the situational awareness, to taqwa, to navigate the thorns and the tides without being destroyed. Pharaoh lacked taqwa. He lacked situational awareness. He marched blindly into the thorns because he thought he was too important to bleed.
Yes.
Moses had taqwa. He read the map, he understood the tides, and he navigated the gap.
It is a profound shift from a passive, superstitious faith to an active, intellectually engaged relationship with reality. And just as we grasp this massive macro-level collapse of an empire that ignored reality, the source material executes a cinematic smash cut.
It really does.
We immediately transition from the muddy, chaotic shores of the Red Sea straight into a tense, intimate conversation between Abraham and his father. Verses 26.69 to 74.
Which brings us to part 4. The micro-pharaoh. I have to admit, the first time I looked at this outline, this pivot felt jarring.
I can see that.
You have this epic narrative of an empire falling, and then suddenly we are auditing a family's religious beliefs.
Right.
Why the sudden pivot? Help us understand the connecting tissue here.
The transition is utterly seamless if you are reading the text as a sociological treatise rather than a chronological history book.
Okay, explain that.
The text is revealing that Abraham's community, his father, his neighbors, are running the exact same structural logic as Pharaoh's empire. It is just localized to a single family unit.
Wow.
Abraham is dealing with the institution of idolatry. But just as we did with the Red Sea, we have to strip away the simplistic Sunday school version of ignorant people bowing to statues because they don't know any Torah. The linguistic key that unlocks this entire section is in verse 71, where the community describes their relationship to these idols. They use the word akifina.
Let's slow down and unpack akifina. What does that actually mean in a structural sense beyond just worshiping?
The root of akifina means to be settled, to be entirely committed, to be immovably attached to something. It describes a state of profound structural inertia.
Structural inertia.
Yes. When Abraham asks them, "What are you worshiping?" they don't just say, "We worship idols." They say, "We are devoted to these forms, and we will remain akifina, immovably, stubbornly attached to them."
Like they are bolted to the floor.
Exactly. The text is revealing something critical here. Their worship is not an active daily choice based on ongoing rational evaluation. It is a locked-in state. It is the dead weight of a system that has entirely lost its forward momentum and its ability to adapt.
It's cognitive paralysis, and this is where Abraham initiates what the source essentially frames as a systematic epistemological audit.
Yes, an audit.
I mean, he acts less like a traditional prophet preaching a sermon and more like a hostile forensic accountant auditing a corrupt company. He puts their entire belief system on trial to see if it holds any water in the real world.
Right.
He cross-examines them. He says, okay, let's look at the actual output of this system you are immovably attached to. Do these idols hear you when you call out to them? They're forced to admit no.
No, they don't.
Okay, do they benefit you in any tangible, observable way? No. Do they harm you if you ignore them? No.
It is a devastatingly effective line of questioning because it exposes the total lack of causality at the heart of their society. Abraham is systematically pointing out that there is zero causal connection between their practices and any observable outcome in the real world.
Yeah.
The system produces absolutely nothing of value. It has no mechanism.
So the obvious next question is, why do they do it? And their answer, this is the chilling part, because we hear this exact same justification in corporate boardrooms, in political institutions, and in families today. They say, we found our fathers doing this. That is their ultimate, final defense.
Which Abraham immediately identifies as intellectually bankrupt. His core argument is that an action whose only justification is that it predates your own reasoning is not a valid reason at all.
Right.
It is merely an inheritance. And the source makes a very sharp distinction here. Inherited practices that possess no rational foundation, no observable benefit, and no mechanism for self-correction are not traditions. They are just the structural inertia of past arrangements.
They're dead weight. It's the tyranny of unproven assertions. And this is exactly where we see the direct link back to Pharaoh. Let's trace this back. When Moses challenged Pharaoh's authority, how did Pharaoh justify his absolute rule and his enslavement of the Israelites?
He invoked former generations.
Exactly. He essentially told Moses, this is how the system was set up by our ancestors. This is how we've always done it. Who are you to disrupt the continuity? Abraham's father is using the exact same playbook to defend his idols.
Because the underlying social architecture of both systems is identical, and the source provides a really brilliant socioeconomic insight here to explain why they cling to this dead weight.
I want to hear this.
We have to ask, why does Abraham's father react so violently to this logical audit? It's not because he has a deep personal biological connection to a piece of carved stone.
No.
It is because that stone is the central load-bearing pillar of their entire socioeconomic system.
Give me the mechanics of how that actually works, because modern listeners might struggle to see how a statute controls an economy. How did the priesthood actually operate in these ancient agrarian societies? The source uses this phrase, the priests milked the cow while the king held the horns. Unpack the causality there.
In these ancient setups, the religious leadership functioned directly as an arm of state power and economic extraction. Think about an agrarian society. Wealth is grain, livestock, and land.
Right.
The temple, where the idols are housed, acted as the central bank and the tax collection agency. The priesthood dictates that the gods require offerings, grain, livestock, wealth to ensure a good harvest or to prevent a plague.
So it's an extortion racket.
Effectively, yes. The productive class, terrified of divine retribution, hands over their surplus value to the temple. The priests collect this wealth, essentially milking the cow.
And the king holds the horns by providing the military force to protect the temple and enforce the social hierarchy while receiving divine validation from the priests in return.
Exactly.
The religious structure validates the political extraction.
Yes. The idols themselves don't produce any real output. As Abraham proved, they don't hear, benefit, or harm, but they produce massive social cohesion around inherited authority. They are the psychological mechanism that keeps the productive class willingly handing over their wealth. So, when Abraham starts applying basic logic and disproving the idol, it feels catastrophic to his father and the community.
Because it's a threat to the economy.
Exactly. Not because the idol is biologically real, but because the economy of the temple, the strict social hierarchy, and the father's own comfortable position of power within it are very real. Disproving the idol means collapsing the economy. It means the priests lose their unearned wealth, and the king loses his divine justification to rule.
So when Abraham takes an axe to the idols, he isn't just breaking rocks. He is breaking the supply chain of the extractive economy.
Yes.
He is disrupting the monopoly. He is a micro-Moses, dismantling a micro-Pharaoh. And that brings us to the grand synthesis of this entire text. Part 5. Permanence, change, and crossing the gap.
This is where we fully bridge the two narratives. Why does the text place the macro collapse of Pharaoh at the Red Sea immediately next to the micro confrontation of Abraham at the family dinner table?
Right, why?
Because they are the exact same argument, playing out at different scales. They are both profound case studies in what happens when a system, any system, refuses to align with reality.
Let's look at the gaps. At the macro level, with Pharaoh, you have a literal, physical, structural gap, the sea.
Yes.
On one side of the water, you have the productive population that actually creates value, the Israelites. On the other side, you have the extractive system that only knows how to capture and consume that value, Pharaoh's army.
Right.
The physical gap of the Red Sea represents the inevitable structural separation that must occur between a host and a parasite when the host finally decides to walk away.
And at the micro level with Abraham's family, the separation isn't a body of water. It is an intellectual cognitive gap.
A cognitive gap.
Yes. Abraham is asking his own father, his own community, to cross the cognitive gap between inherited inertia, the akifina, the paralyzing dead weight of we found our fathers doing this, and rational, observable cause and effect evaluation.
The ultimate question these texts are forcing us to ask, whether we are looking at an empire or a family, is this. What do you do when you wake up and realize You are operating inside a system whose foundational claims cannot survive a rational audit.
Right.
What do you do when the system demands your subjugation or demands that you blindly comply with practices that produce zero real-world benefit?
The answer the text provides is uncompromising and universally applicable. You cannot reform it from within. You cannot negotiate with Takabur because zero accountability does not compromise.
No, it doesn't.
You cannot reason with a stone idol that forms the basis of someone else's unearned wealth. The solution in both the macro and the micro case studies is the exact same. You name the gap. You execute a strategic withdrawal from the irrational premise. You cross the gap, whether it's a physical border or a cognitive leap, and you begin the incredibly hard work of building a new, rationally sound system from the other side.
You don't wait for a magic wand to fix the empire.
Right.
You use your situational awareness, your takwa, to read the map, navigate the thorns, understand the tides, and walk out.
It truly is a masterclass in social physics. The text leaves us with a stark reality. History and tradition are only valuable when they can survive the light of rational evaluation.
Absolutely.
If they cannot produce observable benefit, if they cannot be rationally defended, they are no longer traditions to be revered. They are simply the thorny bushes holding you back from progress.
This has been an incredibly intense, eye-opening intellectual journey. We've moved from the literal physics of a collapsing empire drowning in the mud of its own arrogance to the logic-driven intervention of a son auditing his father's deeply held beliefs.
It's a huge scope.
It really is. We've stripped away the Hollywood spectacle, the magic wands, and the superstitious comfort food to find the cold, hard, brilliant machinery of sociology and systems engineering operating underneath.
It completely revolutionizes how we engage with ancient texts. It forces us to read history not as a series of magical, unpredictable interventions, but as a precise mirror reflecting the structural consequences of human behavior and systemic design.
So we want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought. Building on everything we've unpacked today, take a hard, unforgiving look at the systems you operate in right now.
Right.
Look at your workplace. Look at the organizations you give your time and money to. Look at your community, or even your own daily personal habits. Are you navigating those systems with the clear-eyed situational awareness of a master engineer? Or are you just defending the structural inertia because that's how the founders did it, or that's how we've always done it?
Identify your idols.
Exactly. Identify your idols. Do the epistemological audit on your own life. Audit their real-world outcomes, and then ask yourself the hardest question of all. What is the Red Sea you need to logically, rationally cross to get to the other side?